All right, we're live. Cool. So let me share my screen really quickly. Let's ungray ourselves, those of our who are here. Welcome, everybody. This is the Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group meeting at the Open Source Security Foundation. Do we have anyone who's with us here for the first time?
Yes, this is my first meeting.
Okay, welcome. That's first. Would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Todd Cullum, and I work at Red Hat on the product security team for the RHEL product.
Awesome. Welcome. Alrighty. So the agenda for today is really quite open. And last time around, the agenda was pretty packed, and we had really an awesome discussion. But I think I would like to get us to a point where we kind of narrow down the topics we want to focus on. Because it seems that there is no shortage of topics we would want to discuss, and I think last week was an excellent example of that. But we haven't really like we touched on the problem that we have, this process, or I think let's call it the process of disclosing vulnerabilities between different parties, and we haven't really then done an exercise of, okay, so what is it that we really want to improve, or where do we see the existing processes and tools falling short of the needs? And if I remember correctly, we identified a couple of different stakeholders. We identified definitely open source maintainers as one of the kind of key stakeholders. We identified security research community. I think we chatted about like tool vendors and companies that do disclosure for, or companies or organizations that actually handle disclosures for product that they don't necessarily own. Last but definitely not least, we have chatted about consumers of open source vulnerability information. And our goal for today would be to start a conversation. What kind of pain points do you all see as you are either in a position of a particular stakeholder or interacting with them? And I think it's we have a very good group where we have people who are interacting or are like different types of players in that ecosystem, or at least are able to articulate those pain points well. So what I thought we could do is to start like listing the pain points and grievances and things that could be better in the world, and group them in those large buckets like maintainers, consumers, security research community, and let's call them like coordination organizations and bodies. Does that sound like a plan?
It does, but I feel like we started this before and we may want to go back, find those notes, copy them in and build on them. Or would you rather do clean slate?
I was about to almost say the same, that I posted the link of the meeting of the last one of October, and we had started doing some work there. It's the third main bullet on the meeting notes.
Oh, there you go. Oh yeah, I remember that discussion. So I think we also, I'm trying to think of a way to kind of get us focused. And I think at that point, we discussed that we could really like try to, for example, think about use cases for big mature projects, say like the Linux kernel, or like all the way down to a hobby developer that they have their open source projects successful or maybe not successful yet, but they want to do security, but they have absolutely no idea how. Right. So and I think there are plenty of projects and even entire communities that are somewhere in between. Right. They don't have like corporate sponsorship. They're all volunteers. They perhaps could have access to the infrastructure if they knew what is it that they needed. And like, is there a particular group that you would want to like focus on when it comes to maintainers, for example? Because let's focus on the first group that are maintainers. Do we have someone who's a maintainer of a reasonably popular open source project here? So that might be a good criteria to pick up. Who do we have in the room?
I'd make Reed talk.
I mean, I've been an open source maintainer for many, many years, but for various smaller projects and I mean, bigger ones too. I mean, I used to work for Mozilla many years ago and on Firefox and then worked on their security team and such. But yeah, so I'm happy to talk about any of that stuff. I think that in general, it's especially the open source community is just that like, hey, it's a volunteer efforts. And so it's, best effort kind of thing. So any way to provide the open source community with templates or like ways to do things easily that they can just follow would make their lives much easier. Just kind of like what GitHub has done with like auto-generate a security policy by default and some other things. That would be kind of the direction to go is like, hey, this is kind of how you should direct people to report security vulnerabilities. This is kind of how you should think about how to handle incoming security vulnerabilities. So, because again, we're, maybe we can focus a few things that are platform specific, but in general, even just having a template of like, here's the kind of things you want to think about would probably be helpful. And then partnering with all these different groups to kind of make that be used. So partnering with GitHub and GitLab and other kind of like source control management stuff that like can automatically generate these things and put them in front of the open source developers, maintainers as they're creating projects and creating repositories and things like that.
Or because like I don't want to be like the devil's advocate, but perhaps this is something that should be handled by, I don't know, like package repositories, or this like the fact of like there is a security, like there's an implied security policy that you can report a security vulnerability, maybe not necessarily to the individual maintainer because those can be hard to find. They can be hard to contact by someone that's just looking at, say, an NPM package or a GitHub repository. Maybe it makes more sense to kind of facilitate like package maintainers, or not package maintainers, but package repositories acting as sort of
the registry. You're talking about the package registries. What is the like? I fully support of having the registries be a way to report things in some fashion. I mean, like NPM JS has been doing this for a long time. The Node.js working group, security working group has done something similar. I mean, there have been a couple of different ways of doing this, but in the end, they're not the ones fixing the issue. It still has to go back to the maintainer. Right. Like at a certain point, maybe they can disclose the issue, but a lot of these registries are also either volunteer run themselves or backed by some commercial entity that then you're saying like, okay, this commercial entity should be the one to get the vulnerabilities for that. It is an issue there of like how do you handle those kind of things. In the end, I think that you still need to involve the maintainers somehow, and that it needs to be part of just like, you know, if somebody's writing code, they also need to be thinking about how to handle not only incoming bug reports, because that's just a common thing. I mean, people use whatever like GitHub issues or whatever for that, but like how do you handle, you know, security issues for that as well?
How do you handle the attitude, sometimes a little aggressive, of people contacting you as a maintainer with a security issue that, you know, are extremely pushy in the sense of, this is really bad, you need to fix it, what kind of code are you writing, etc. That can be a little intense to manage.
I don't disagree on that, but isn't the same thing as like you receive a bug report and like, oh, this is a really bad bug, you must fix it ASAP.
Yeah, but when it's a bug, it prevents somebody from doing something correctly, but it, you know, a security issue opens the doors literally to all kinds of nasty things.
Yeah.
I think the perception is slightly different.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I would love. I know somebody had asked from this group recently, like, hey, you had some open source projects that wanted to learn more about how to handle vulnerabilities. Maybe better offering services to like, hey, I'm not sure how to deal with this. Like a way that the community can reach out and get assistance from security experts as part of this. Could be something useful. I don't know. I mean, I think that's just one of the common problems with open source is that you have unpaid, you know, volunteer maintainers who, you know, don't have a lot of the support that they need and are expected to drop everything and fix things ASAP. Yeah, I mean, it is unrealistic expectations that we put on the maintainers in a lot of ways. So if there's anything that we or other organizations can do to assist in that process.
And by the way, what you said there, you know, about, you know, accepting all of these and not taking it personally, because it's when it's your code and somebody, you know, makes a comment on a bug, especially a security one, very often people in the initial reaction is because they're taking it personally, is like, that can't be possible, I don't want to hear it. And it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, but I wonder what is it that we as a working group could kind of do to help in this particular use case where we have a volunteer kind of effort who's that is not necessarily like they don't have security expertise, they are not quite aware of like how to handle security vulnerabilities, who to coordinate with, how to disclose them. And I think like this, you're touching on something that is, I think, very important, but it's like I would love for us to be able to do something about it. But I think it's just the nature of volunteer open source work that you take your work with a lot of like pride and emotions, right? It's like, it's my baby that I put it out there for free, and all I'm getting is like feedback that it's, well, ugly and full of security holes.
If the mechanism for reporting a security as a security issue includes something like a very factual form to fill, it tends to be maybe a little less a vector for aggression than if it's a free text sent by somebody sending an email with just, you know, just a free text where people write emotionally instead of clicking, selecting, you know, type of severity, medium, super strong, open door for hacker, whatever. And I don't know, it's some way to make the reporting filter out some of the aggressivity, by potential aggressivity. Some people are just really nice about it and even send a bug fix. Was I've had that happen when I was at Sun Microsystems, and it works well. But you know, I don't know.
I
making a
think
comment.
that's, you know, I agree, but I also think that that is sadly part of maintaining an open source project in a way.
True.
At the same time, I think it comes around to setting those expectations up front. And so if you do provide a way to report it and say there's a form you fill out, whatever it is, like setting the expectations for the researcher or the reporter, and that they know that like, hey, this is how it's going to be handled and such, it seems to make things much better, because if there's no process, then I think that frustrates people and like, okay, I don't know how to report this. I don't know if it's getting to the right people. I don't know how it's going to handle it, how quickly it's going to be looked at. Like that just causes a lot of that human emotion that you mentioned.
I fully agree.
Cut all that out. I think you can hopefully make the process, the interaction better.
I think that's a great comment. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that if we could, David, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, has anybody reviewed the current version of the GitHub standard vulnerability reporting template? Because there is one, you click a button and you get yourself a security.md file. I haven't looked at it recently, but there is such a thing. One problem, GitHub's the most, GitHub, GitLab, I think are the two most common repo systems. And I agree, you need to report to the actual people developing or nothing happens. But in at least the GitHub case, and I haven't checked on GitLab, there's no way to privately report. You can privately handle it, but you can't privately report. So maybe this group could work with GitHub, GitLab, anybody else, so that private reporting would work.
Yeah, actually, do we have anyone from GitHub in this group right now? I don't think so. Because I chatted with them some time ago, and I think they had it on the roadmap, but honestly, I have absolutely no idea where they ended up with private reporting, because that seems to be a pretty glaring hole in like the whole flow. Right.
They are aware of that. I talked with some of the Microsoft transition team when they were in the process of buying GitHub, and I know Nat was interested in that. However, they ended up with GitHub Security, was it Advisor? I forgot what the system is, but they have a system for discussing it, but not for reporting it. So once you know, you can deal with it, but you have no way to find out privately.
Yeah, this has been a pain point for, I'm Dan from Google, and we have a team that operates a bunch of fuzzers on open source projects, and this is a pain point for them as well, because they need an automated place to report issues that these fuzzers find. So they've actually stood up their own issue tracker where maintainers of projects have to opt in and create accounts and stuff where it can all be shared privately before it gets reported upstream.
Yeah, just to be clear, you can have private issues. So once they know about it, they can discuss them privately, but they can't find out. Right. I've been recommending people to, and by the way, if GitHub is not interested in doing that, we could develop proposed alternatives. I've been telling folks to use, start TLS emails, because that's at least hop-to-hop encrypted, and people who use them. I've so many people, GPG, what's that? And they're not going to do it. So, but I think there are ways to do it, but maybe we need to write down, here is what we suggest, for a small project. Here's something you can do quickly to make things happen without spending your lifetime trying to set things up.
I think potentially a good next step, because I think Josh brought it up, and Eva, thank you for pasting the security report. I tossed it in the notes, but I think maybe over the next week, putting together use cases for, like, if we just concentrate on maintainers to start, if that's where we want to start with, what are the use cases they would need, and maybe mark next to it at what maturity level they would need that, and see if there is existing prior art out there, and what, note any flaws, like the prior art of the GitHub. And GitLab, we have the same problem. You can make sort of a private issue, but the private issue is anybody who can contribute to the project. So if it's an open source project, you can't really, so you have to make a separate repo. And I can talk to our plan team to see if there's anything on the backlog for that. But what we could do is just start with, here's the couple of use cases that we feel are most critical. Here's prior art that exists and the flaws. Is it on the roadmap or not? And there might be 2 or 3 prior arts for each use case, but at least then we can at least start having a place to direct people, like, here's what there is, here's some alternatives like disclose.io. You know, if you don't want to do a workaround or you don't want to wait for that backlog item, that might actually help us at least zone in on where the biggest flaws are.
So
If we need a case study, I think the Envoy project had 2 security issues reported 2 weeks ago publicly on GitHub, and they had to rush out an emergency release because there were essentially 0 days that got made public without people realizing what was happening.
yeah.
You can find the links for that.
Yeah, so I don't know how, like, for example, the OpenJS community, how representative that community is, but it's a set of JavaScript projects of varying level of maturity. And some of them are pretty mature. So some time ago, I did like a survey of the security reporting practices in that community. So I can definitely paste the link later on. Maybe that's going to be like a good seed of for that sort of table. Okay, we have a project and we think they are mature, and this is how they handle confidential disclosure. But like, this is something that we're talking about it in the context of the receiving side, so maintainers. But there's also like the other side, which is the security researcher trying to report a vulnerability. So is there anything that you all think is kind of broken or in need of improvement from that side?
I think it's all covered in the prior notes, at least the experiences I've had.
And so ideally, you would go into a project, see a security policy, and you have a very clear idea of how to report a vulnerability. Is there any, because I know that it's for, especially for volunteer or for projects that rely on volunteers, it's an endless source of frustration for security researchers that, like, this, if there is a reporting mechanism, it's essentially a black hole sometimes. And could we do anything there to kind of not drive security researchers away from open source projects towards like commercial bug bounty programs where they can earn some money, and companies are usually much better at responding, keeping in touch with the researchers, and with open source projects, if there is a commercial entity behind it, then perfect. That is essentially as if you were interacting with a commercial company. But for a lot of projects, is, you know, it depends on maintainer pretty much availability.
I mean, you know, there have been ways, again, like kind of like the Node.js working groups, you know, security ecosystem program, and others that have kind of been a way for people to just kind of report issues wholesale to some trusted group of people, and then that trusted group of people tries to get in touch with the maintainer, or has the ability to kind of go to the registry and say like, hey, can we mark this as being, you know, has a vulnerability that, you know, we're not able to get in touch with the maintainer or whatever thing. So, I mean, I think there needs to be better coordination there. You know, that like, and I think you have to bring that down to as close to the possible of the language of that it's written in, because like it's, I mean, yeah, you could have a group, a larger group, like, you know, the Linux Foundation could put something together. You know, this foundation, the Open Source Security Foundation could put some kind of thing together, but you still have to provide the resources to triage these incoming issues, to, you know, do your best to track down the maintainers, partner with the registries. I mean, it is a lot of work, but maybe that's something that needs to be better done, to, you know, have the avenue, because there is a lot of open source that, you know, okay, a maintainer isn't easily accessible, or, you know, it's kind of the bus problem of like the bus factor problem of like, okay, there's one guy or one person working on this and hits by a bus, and then what do you do with that? So
yeah, so one thing we learned in the Node.js ecosystem working group, that for those of you who are not familiar, is essentially a group of volunteers triaging findings for a bug bounty program for which the scope is essentially all of the NPM, all of what's in the NPM package manager, like we learned that this is really not sustainable. And security researchers they come with certain expectations about like the timeliness of response. And since it's a multi-party system where we have researchers, we have people who are doing the triage, and we have maintainers, sometimes that process takes ages or is not concluded at all. Because, for example, I had cases where I triaged a vulnerability, I reached out to the maintainer, they sent me an initial response that they're fixing it. Therefore, like I said, okay, we're going to wait until they fix it. And half a year later, like no contact whatsoever, right? And like those cases are pretty, those cases can get pretty tense for the person doing triage, the security researcher, maybe the maintainer as well. So this again seems to be a thing that could be fixed by a really, really solid security policy that says not only what the maintainer can expect of the researcher not to go public before it is fixed, but I think it would also have to go the other way around. That, for example, we have a policy that when the maintainers don't respond within, I don't know, 30, 60, 90 days, the researcher can, like, I know there's a big debate about, but should they go public? Can they go public with a vulnerability? Is this a problem we have a standing chance of addressing?
We're never, being in that community, we're never going to get the two sides of the responsible disclosure versus like free all the vulns versus the never free all the vulns people. Like there's not going to be a kumbaya moment for those groups. But I think that, to your point, if we say like, make sure you put that, at least in 30 days, you're going to acknowledge it or whatever. But I think kind of an interesting thing that's been coming up this meeting is, what if there were escalation points? Like if you don't, we could like literally build in by default into the policy, if you don't get a response from the maintainer, try the package manager or the repository, or try GitHub or GitLab, because I know GitHub and GitLab are both CNAs at this point. And so you could actually be like, if you don't hear back from the maintainer in their proposed amount of days, the recommended next step. So this way, instead of them immediately jumping to my next step is either disclose or whatever, but you could almost offer a go check where it's hosted to see if they have a reporting policy, or go check the repo. So maybe just offering next steps.
Oh, I wonder if, maybe this is maybe this is the direction that this is going in, but maybe building out that sort of that frame of reference. So you have an open source project. What should you be doing when you think about security? What are the elements that you should have as part of your VDP? Should you have a VDP? When do you need one? What, we talk about policies, process, guidelines, all of that, for the different kinds of stakeholders, and how do you mature your project as you go along? Because you're not, a small project out of the gate, 1, 2, 3 maintainers may not need all that overhead, or not realize they need it when they grow, right? If we don't have some kind of a set of guidelines. And I think we can take the numbers, the response times out of it, because there are so many different variations. I can speak to my own environment where there's layers upon layers of complexity when it comes to the disclosure timelines. But the responses to the researchers have to be timely, while the disclosures may be complicated. So, and you have to have more communications. How do you communicate that? So I'm just thinking about, this kind of a framework where we can lay out, you're an open source project. Here are the things you need to think about when it comes to vulnerability disclosure, what elements you should put in place.
And 2 points. Unless something is commercially supported, having a policy is going to be challenging for a hobbyist or someone doing this out of the joy of coding. So we need to think about, but before we put a policy in place, this is kind of a negotiation. It's a suggestion. And
Yeah.
I think a way we can be successful in articulating that desire or that need is through the Developer Best Practices Working Group. It's a sister group of this one. So I think as we have our guidance and suggestions together, we can move over to that group and provide that as guidance and training and education for open source developers, saying, if you want to have higher levels of maturity or more contributions or potentially future commercial backing, here's some good practices you should exhibit, like having a VDP or some type of policy, having a secure way to share vulnerabilities, all these things. So we can kind of put these out as good practices and evangelize it through the other working group as well.
Right, but then again, can we do something for consumers to say like, okay, this is the project you're trying to add as a dependency for your whatever, you're building a system, a device or whatever. Like it doesn't have a security policy. It doesn't have a VDP. It's like,
and that's
maybe
tools like the CII badges.
Maybe consider that your kind of your own risk.
Yeah, so there are other working groups like the CII badges or the I can't recall what I call it, the metrics group, but that's not the right. There's a group that's looking to do dashboards around reporting kind of the securityness of open source projects. So as a consumer, we can suggest, if you care about the security of the software you're using, here are some mechanisms that projects can demonstrate their adherence to good practice. There's a lot of interconnection between these different groups we're all kind of orbiting around.
And I think eventually our plan was to find ways to stitch them together, but I think that's way far off in our future at this point.
Yeah, but I think it like, at least in my mind, it brings a question whether we should focus on trying to find a way to help projects that are not necessarily willing to like put in the effort or don't have the capacity to like staff some sort of security triage and response.
That's not our, I mean, I could be wrong, but for ours is about vulnerability disclosure is kind of our objective, is to cover that. So if some group of maintainers or whatever doesn't care about security, that's not in our purview. That could be like a different working group that wants to work about education or whatever. But I think, you know, since we're about vulnerability disclosure, somebody is curious about, and you know, at least curious about, and they want to come to what we've published to be like, okay, well, where would I start? And what does that mean for me? Is kind of where I see us, not anyone who's like, I don't care.
If I could push back just a little bit, because I think you make some good points, but I think part of the problem is we're trying to cover so many different kinds of situations. I mean, the Linux kernel folks, they've got a whole team. That's one kind of situation. You know, if you report to Red Hat and it's a core part of their product, you know, they've got a whole team. If there's a maintainer and the maintainer works for a few hours a week on the weekends, and that's what you got, and this is their hobby of their hobby, it's totally unreasonable to expect the same level. So for example, I think for a lot of open source projects, where I'm moving towards is, the expectation is a vulnerability report is code. A whine is not really adequate. It's here's the problem and here's the proposed solution. And I think for a lot of open source projects, that's what they're expecting. And a report that says something doesn't work properly is not, you still haven't given them anything useful yet. Now I don't know, I think that may be a challenge because it's a complete disconnect. The security researchers are not used to reporting that they may not even know how to write the code.
Yeah,
exactly.
And yet that's the expectation.
Right. Speaking for a bunch of security researchers, I know they can't. I mean, maybe sometimes they can curl and whatever, but they're not going to write some software from scratch. Now, there's exceptions, obviously.
Right.
Which is.
But I think this is the challenge.
That's a big disconnect.
Yes.
I'm wondering, like, how do we, like, we're not going to solve that problem because it's a really big leap, but I'm wondering if we could put some recommendations around, and I'm going to go switch to my hat. I run the Diana Initiative, which is an information security conference that has a couple thousand people, all women. Obviously, it would be bigger if we went co-ed, but whatever. And there we have different presentations, and we try and tell people how they get involved in finding securities and having things on their resumes they've experienced. So I'm wondering if we actually put together something that could be given at conferences or to people who arrange conferences to explain, hey, you have a bunch of security researchers who want to contribute and get stuff on their resume. Here's some recommendations of how not to be a dick and how to participate and be useful and helpful, and pair up with open source projects. Like if we put together some guidelines, that might actually encourage more researchers to participate in these projects and get closer to what you stated as the ideal, which I agree, which is here's the code, here's the problem.
Yeah, that would be lovely. And I think the first very basic like prerequisite for that to work is that the open source project has to opt in into that sort of collaboration. And like if we can sort of facilitate, for example, having a security policy, maybe having a security policy with a paragraph there, we're open to working with, we actually encourage security researchers to submit vulnerability reports to us because we have the capacity and the will to address those. That would be amazing. So a lot of what I'm hearing is that we could, like with the private reporting part aside, which requires like some product development, but it seems like working on like a really, really solid security policy or VDP template could be potentially a very impactful thing for us to focus on.
I
Yes,
agree. I think we could provide for all the different stakeholder groups, we can provide suggested guidance on part for their perspective of the vulnerability disclosure pipeline, what they could or should do. And I think the policy is a great thing, Marcin. I think we also can have some guidance on for those maintainers. Here are some things some capabilities you might want to think about researching, or friends you should go ask for help. And for consumers and reporters and commercial providers, I think we can provide guidance for each of those stakeholder groups.
And I think to avoid biting off a lot, I don't know whether we want to split into a couple smaller groups temporarily to everybody work on a particular area and come back, on date X with like our list of here's the use cases and here's our recommended templates that exist and the things that we want to try and contribute to them because they're missing it or whatever. But yeah, I think that would be a good next step.
Art, I think Art, you've raised your hand.
Oh yeah, sorry. Thanks. So I'm very new here, but I'm going to raise this question anyway. And first of all, this line of work we're talking about today, I don't have any problem with proceeding with it by any means. I will comment. My observation is that this is a lot of already trodden ground, and when I say trodden, I mean like stamped on by armies of elephants, really, really smashed, trodden. There's a lot of stuff. It's not. There may need to be more, and that's perfectly fine. But there might be, if we pop up a level from the sort of the disclosure policy discussion, there might be other things in the disclosure coordination, vulnerability stuff, at scale that applies to, LF constituencies. There might be things that this group could target that are less well trodden, greater gaps than all the disclosure stuff. And again, I'm not going to. I don't mean to be the lone cranky voice saying don't do this. I'm not really saying that, but there may be places to invest that are bigger gaps than the disclosure policy area.
Just to add a little context, because I'm not sure if we made it clear, and maybe I did, and you can just say still applies. I think we originally, early on in this group, decided we don't want to invent any new formats policies because you have the XKCD
yes.
thing. We want to create a place where somebody could go and we say, here's the top 1 or 2 suggested ones, here's the other 5 that are out there, and then we could actually talk to those and be like, by the way, people would use you more if you consider adding this or this, but if you don't, whatever. But we wanted to more be something that said, hey, if you are a maintainer or you're a security researcher, here is our recommended thing that's out there. And then eventually get to stitching them together, how we could get them all to flow better. So I don't know if that influences what you said.
Somewhat, I think, given that, collating, framing, organizing existing stuff sounds a little bit less new work to me. So I think that does help. And again, this is my second meeting, so I may be out of context here as well. I guess my comment still somewhat applies. And, this is also a matter of personal opinion. It might be that I personally am tired of this discussion and others are not. So that's, I will not stand in the way of anything, certainly. But I do see some newer, might be some newer gaps, and I could be prepared to talk about those at a future call. Thanks.
Definitely. So I think we have about 15 minutes to go. So should or could we attempt distilling some next steps out of this discussion?
So I'll echo what Nicole said. Do we feel we'll be more productive if we divide up into 4 or 5 smaller groups to focus in and then report back to the larger group on these specific areas?
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think the problem we've always had as a working group is that like this particular meeting is where we do work, and ideally the work would happen between those meetings, and then we would kind of meet again every second week and chat about what was done.
Is anyone opposed to working outside of this call on this project?
I'm happy to spend some time in between with a small group of people.
Me too.
This is crazy talk, Crow.
I don't have enough non-working
Right.
meetings. I need more.
But no, this is a worthwhile topic, though.
Shouldn't we first define what are the different use cases? And once we've done this, split? Because even if we split now, it's not well defined what each group is going to focus on.
I believe the use cases are already in the notes. So we have maintainers, we have security researchers, we have consumers, and then providers. Are there any other perspectives we're missing out of those 4?
My understanding was that these are the different parties, not the different use cases, because different use cases, we talked about a vendor that has an open source project or someone who does it voluntarily. So these are different use cases.
Yeah, and I think that's what Nicole's suggesting, is that we divide those areas up and suss out the details under each heading. Is that correct, Nicole?
There are some suggested use cases in each one of the groups, but I think the groups, the first thing they'd have to do is validate that those are sufficient use cases and they like them. So I'm kind of thinking like the first thing is here's the use cases. Then the next thing is for this use case, we recommend XYZ that already exists, or we need to research it more. I just feel that we keep bouncing between all the different personas in the larger meeting, which makes it a little crazy.
Okay. Is there anyone who like wants to take a lead on like fleshing out those use cases? I don't know, like a quick markdown document, maybe in the README, and then we could start like breaking out the work there.
I mean, I'll do it for the security researcher persona to start, and I can start fleshing up the use cases there.
I'm glad to take the lead on the provider's use cases.
Okay. Anyone wants to take the lead on maintainers?
I can.
Oh, cool. Awesome. And I think we have consumers left.
I can probably try contribute to the consumer part of it, as that's sort of what I do.
Okay, that's very cool. I was actually not sure if anyone here kind of identifies very strongly with the consumer community, even though to an extent probably every one of us does this from time to time. It's like, oh, I'm going to use an open source project to make my code simpler. And suddenly you're a consumer of vulnerability information and you don't know about it.
So Marcin, is there when we say consumers, right? Based on what you just said, you're talking about consumers of the project. Is there another stakeholder group for consumers of the vendor software, consumers of the software?
Yeah, I think so far we have not been distinguishing those two groups, but I think you're right that.
Yeah, they're quite distinct. They're completely different personas, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that the consumers of open source projects, like it's fair to assume that they rely on tool vendors to consume that information. That it's very rarely, I think, that I've seen someone consuming vulnerability information straight from the projects. Although I've seen it once.
I mean, so what
Ava has seen this too.
Yeah, I mean, what happens in practice is the consumers will get alerted to the vulnerability in the software typically before the vendor has notified them. And then they will go to the vendor and say, my vulnerability scan has now detected this new vulnerability in open source component XYZ. What are you doing about it? That's actually the flow that's seen in practice. It doesn't actually typically come from the vendors, unless you're talking about vendors in terms of the operating system vendors like Red Hat and Ubuntu and SUSE, etc. might be an exception to that. But in terms of commercial software that's using open source code, the consumers will often have view of the vulnerability before the vendor has provided anything, because the vulnerability scanning infrastructure that they use will have, they get 0-day updates, right? So as soon as the vulnerability is reported into the community, it'll show up at all of the end enterprise users. They'll be notified of it, even though the vendor might not have any reaction yet.
So I think there's sort of two definitions of consumers in this case. It's both the consumers of the data stream from the providers, as well as you have the consumers of sort of their disclosures, announcements. So somebody might, for instance, be using security scanners, which tracks Debian CV announcements or Red Hat CV announcements, and they're sort of one part of the consumer chain. And you also sort of have Red Hat or OpenSUSE or Arch Linux, which also sort of consumes the NVD data streams. So I guess this discussion is a little bit about the distinction between those two groups, sort of the vendor consumers and the consumer consumers, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if
and I think the distinction is we have that provider's persona, which I took to be Red Hat, SUSE, Canonical.
Yes.
As opposed to an end consumer or a developer of a commercial product.
Yes.
So I wonder how because now I'm thinking that we might have implicitly assumed that when we said consumers, at least that's like the mental shortcut that I took, I think, was I was thinking about a vendor, a tool vendor really, and not like an end user developer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm representing or well, I actually am in a lot of these camps various different days of the week, to be honest. But you know, we develop, you know, security products that read all those vulnerability reports and provide them to users, right? And triage and remediate, you know, triage and remediate these vulnerabilities at the end enterprise, right? So the enterprise has, you know, 1,000, 10,000 unpatched vulnerabilities. They have to go and prioritize and triage these things, which things are important, which things are not. That having the view into the actual source reports that we're all discussing here is incredibly important. It's not the vendor specifically, right? As I say, like often the scanners, like your Qualys infrastructure, your Qualys infrastructure will tell you about that vulnerability that just came up in your NPM or Sync or White Source, you name it, right? Like your White Source scan will tell you about that vulnerability in that NPM repo before your vendor. And often you'll have to go back to your vendor and say, because you can't patch it, right? You can't patch it yourself. So you'll have to go to your vendor and say, when do I get this patch? And they'll say, we'll get back to you tomorrow. So figuring all that logistics out to me is important, and how that information cascades through from the open source project through to the the security community, back through the security vendors to the end customer, then back to the software vendor.
So I have an impression that we haven't explored that part of it that much so far. So Jason, I don't know if this is something that you would like to take a lead on, or maybe for one of the future kind of working group meetings, you could come and, you know, just describe and maybe do a little presentation of how the whole workflow kind of looks from your perspective, because I think it's something that would help us kind of flesh out those use cases.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that in a future session. And you know, I'm not trying to boil the ocean here, so I realize we're trying to focus on one problem, as you said. So
yeah.
So did I capture correctly that the consumers are data stream users? So they're using like the feeds that have already been aggregated, versus the providers are probably getting non-feed access, or is there a different delimitation there?
Sorry, I didn't totally follow. I guess, what do you mean by data stream? You mean vulnerability reports?
Vulnerability data reports from think CV streams from NVD or Mitra, which is aggregated and forwarded essentially, or when you provide the advisory stream, such as OpenSUSE or Red Hat does, I think.
Yeah, so those consumers would be the Qualyses of the world, the White Sources of the world, right? And then they are going and alerting their clients about the vulnerabilities in the products they're using. So consumer, I think
So
this
it sounds
is
like
probably correct, but
sounds like consumer end user persona and consumer tool vendor or security.
Yeah, it's the consumer end user persona, the enterprise or whoever's using the software, right? The consumer or the enterprise.
But like a Qualys is not a provider like a Red Hat or an SAP or a Microsoft that actually gives out software.
They're not a provider. They're a security vendor.
So it sounds like that's different enough of a persona. We probably should account for it.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so we've got intermediary, which is what was the providers, which are intermediary, consumer end user, and then we're going to break off consumer, like security vendors or security scanners. All right.
Yeah, we need a name.
Name to be determined.
And do we have folks that represent that community that could kind of take the lead on those their pain points? I've got pain points for them, but I don't represent that community.
I mean, that is what I do in my day job, but I don't want to have to think about it.
I think part of this is probably a little bit representation last time with the embedding of the CPE information in Docker containers, which would help sort of security scanners. So I assume it's like that sort of use cases, like the embedding of the CPEs, is a little bit more aligned with the security scanner consumer part of it.
Yeah, so I can reach out to, I think we had someone from WhiteSource as well. So I can reach out to past working group meeting participants to tell us a bit more how they are consuming vulnerability information to make those products run. Because like 2 weeks ago, we focused on like the SBOM side of the problem. Is that we have software, we don't know what's inside, but we haven't, I think, touched at all is like, where's the vulnerability information coming from? How is this discovered? How is this processed? How it's ingested? How often? Do you just ingest it once?
And I can tell you it's terrible right now, because how we consume it, there's like 8 different sources that we have to aggregate and then unify so that they match, and then we put it into our own database. So if the person from WhiteSource can't take that on, I can start looking at that next. But yeah, it's terrible right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Terrible sounds like a challenge worth solving, perhaps.
Just to follow up, sorry, very briefly, that's the sort of gap I was considering about my earlier comment. This is a giant mess, this area, and there is not any good existing work. There's existing work, but it's not widely adopted. So I believe there's ripe for progress here. Hopefully, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, very cool. Thank you all. That was good discussion. Yeah.
So it also looks like there's a note in text about we should also fully flesh out our personas a little bit more as another item.
Yeah. Okay. So I can take a lead on that particular part when fleshing out the personas. All right.
A little bit unsure that I've taken more than I can chew, but I'll try and work on the consumer part. I said I would at least. So yeah.
Okay. Cool. I need to jump, but it was good to talk to you. And let's do some work in the next 2 weeks, and let's get back together in 2 weeks and see what we accomplished.